A new generation of leaders is transcending the ancient conflicts of tired divisions of the past and forging a future where the Middle East is defined by commerce, not chaos, where it exports technology, not terrorism, and where people of different nations, religions, and creeds are building cities together.
Hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade deals. U.S. President Donald Trump returns to Washington after signing record-breaking agreements in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE during his inaugural visit to the Gulf since taking his second term in office. And the figures are jaw-dropping. A $142 billion defense deal with Saudi Arabia and an additional $600 billion in other investments, notably in AI. In Doha, Qatar Airways committed to $96 billion in Boeing purchases and signed deals to generate an economic exchange worth $1.2 trillion. On the U.S. president's final stop in the UAE, he signed commercial deals worth billions more. But Mr. Trump also said the UAE would buy advanced semiconductor chips from American companies. But it wasn't all business. Trump's decision to lift sanctions on Syria came as a surprise to some, as did his meeting with interim president Ahmad Al Shara, where he even seemed to take a liking to him.
How did you find the Syrian president?
Great. I think very good. Young, attractive guy, tough guy.
Other discussions also likely took place mostly behind closed doors, with the brewing nuclear deal with Iran at the top of the agenda. Sources say that Gaza was likely discussed as well, with GCC leaders also telling Trump that ending the war, releasing the hostages, and establishing a Palestinian state were of vital importance. And yet, there was much left to the imagination. How quickly could a nuclear agreement materialize? What will it take? What efforts are being made to reach a ceasefire in Gaza? And could we see the normalization of ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In this episode, we ask, what effect will President Trump's visit yield for the Gulf states and the region as a whole, especially against the backdrop of a precarious political landscape? From bold move to subtle comments, there's a lot to unpack from Trump's visit. I start my conversation with the National's Arab Affairs editor, Vanessa Ghanem, who was on the ground in Doha. This was a geoeconomic tour, but there were also key political outcomes of Trump's Gulf visit. What were they?
Yes, it was a dollar-focused tour, and President Donald Trump secured billions in investments and defense contracts, but there were definitely some geopolitical outcomes out of this trip as well. And one of the major outcomes was lifting sanctions on Syria, a major foreign policy shift, and he said that he wants to give Syria an opportunity for a fresh start. But that was not only it. In Riyadh as well, President Trump had a major geopolitical speech in which he mentioned Lebanon, he mentioned Iran, he mentioned important regional flashpoints and issues. He said that Lebanon was terrorized for years by Hezbollah, and that he's willing now to help the new administration in Lebanon. We have a new president and a new prime minister. When it comes to Iran, he said that he sees a close deal with the country, and he said that he prefers diplomacy when it comes to Iran, although some are telling him to maybe pursue a military strike. But no, he insisted on diplomacy, and he says diplomacy will be the first way. He said that Palestinians deserve better also. And we know that he discussed with Qatar, Russia, and Ukraine.
Vanessa, you were reporting from Doha earlier this week, as we saw. But do you know if there were any conversations there, especially for a push for a ceasefire in Gaza?
It's good you said mainly in Doha, because we know Qatar is a key partner in regional mediation, and Qatar has played a central role. A private meeting took place in Doha between Qatar's Emir Sheikh Tamim and President Trump. And that meeting lasted for over than 2 hours. It was initially scheduled for an hour, but it lasted for more than that. And we were reporting from Doha, and we were there on the ground, and there were voices saying that Gaza was likely being discussed behind closed doors. And a lot were hoping that after this meeting, perhaps a ceasefire would be announced. Unfortunately, that remained elusive. The president, after the meeting, he said, we discussed Ukraine, Russia, and Iran, but likely Gaza was likely discussed as well. Israel was not part of this tour, of President Trump's Gulf tour. There's no stop in Israel. And some voices are saying that there is growing frustration from President Trump toward Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the way he is handling the war in Gaza. President Trump has repeatedly said he wants to see peace, and ending the conflict in Gaza was one of his priorities, and this remains elusive until now. So yes, while a ceasefire was not announced during the trip, but we know there are ongoing efforts by the Qataris, by the Egyptians, and by the Americans to try and put an end to the conflict.
So what is the nature of this new iteration of Gulf-US relations? I spoke about this with Mohammed Baharoun, Director General of the Dubai Public Policy Research Center, Bahouth.
Since his second term, President Trump has been reshaping the way politics has been conducted in the region. The major tectonic change he started is the shift from geopolitics to geoeconomics. You can see this in the way the major conflict is not over nuclear weapons anymore, but over tariffs. His priorities in the region will possibly follow suit. We may see a deconstructionist approach to the role of the US in the region from a security provider into an economic partner, something the US didn't care about before. The whole relationship is being reevaluated. The view of either Saudi Arabia or UAE investing in US economy was seen from the prism of the amount of expenditure rather than which area the GCC is spending their money on. I think we're seeing a new Quincy agreement between the GCC and the US, and its foundation was laid down during His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed's visits to DC last year. The basis of that relationship is going to be based on AI, not on oil.
Since Trump's first visit in office, the focus on US Gulf diplomacy centered around the possibility of Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords to normalize ties with Israel. But this time around, it appears as though the issue has been completely delinked from other mutual interests between Riyadh and Washington.
Normalization takes two to tango, and right now, Prime Minister Netanyahu thinks he can have his way regardless what the whole world thinks and the implications to Israel and to the region are. Linking the Saudi nuclear program to normalization with Israel has been the focus of the previous administration, and it went nowhere. It will only push Saudi to fulfill its plan with other partners. The fact that President Trump is not going to Israel during the Middle East visit and canceling the Secretary of Defense visit to Tel Aviv is very significant. But more significant is Washington hosting the French-Saudi summit on two-state solution. And even more so, the reports that President Trump may recognize the state of Palestine to get other Arab states to recognize Israel. This is a direct implementation of the two-state solution without waiting for Bibi's government approval.
It goes without saying, any possibility of a two-state solution would have to begin with a ceasefire in Gaza. Earlier this week, ahead of the Gulf trip, Hamas released American-Israeli hostage Eden Alexander through mediation by Egypt and Qatar. Trump praised it as a step taken in good faith by Hamas. The hope was that it would create momentum for ceasefire talks, but so far, this has not happened yet. So where are we now on Gaza?
On Gaza, I think there is far more agreement than differences, especially on the future role of Hamas, that Hamas itself seems to have accepted. I think objectives are the same. The methods is what is being debated, and we'll see how that is going to be implemented.
The size of investment agreements inked in Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE over the past few days, of course, reflects the relationship between the Gulf states and the US under Trump 2.0. These are big and bold commitments and represent a growing influence that the Gulf states have both in the region and in the West. I discussed some of the key highlights of Trump's visit with Hassan Al-Hassan, Senior Fellow for Middle East Policy at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I asked him to put into context how they could shape conflicts and tensions in the Middle East at this moment. Hassan, what are the most notable differences between Trump's visit to the Gulf in his first term and his current visit? Because in 2017, there also was a US GCC summit. Which areas of focus took priority this time around? And how different is the region that he's returning to?
I think there are very important similarities and differences. Back then, Trump had said several things that were quite distasteful about leaders in the region. He came into office without necessarily having the best relationship with the Gulf states. At the time, regional competition was at its peak. Relations between various countries in the region were quite tense, and countries were essentially at loggerheads and were fairly misaligned on important flashpoints in regional conflicts, including in Yemen and Libya and elsewhere. I think at the moment, it's quite clear that the region is more united. Relations, I think, are much calmer than they used to be. And so I think this is a region that is fairly aligned on its priorities and on how it views regional conflicts and regional issues. I also think that the relationship between the Gulf states and President Trump has largely stabilized. There is a much greater degree of familiarity. The interpersonal links are much stronger and intimate. And I think the Gulf states have really understood how to make themselves quite useful partners to President Donald Trump, be it on his economic agenda by pledging very large investments of over $2 trillion, if we look collectively at the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and also in terms of President Trump's political agenda and trying to help him broker an end to the Russia-Ukraine war, facilitate talks with the Houthis, with the Iranians, and then obviously work to put an end to the conflict in Gaza. But there are similarities as well. And I think the key similarities is that obviously arms deals remain very important. During his first visit, the president announced a $100 billion arms package with Saudi Arabia. This time around, it's valued at $142 billion. But still, obviously, arms and defense were and continue, I think, to be a central focus of US Gulf relations, both under President Trump 1.0 and President Trump 2.0.
Trump's announcement on lifting sanctions in Syria was perceived positively, to say the least. There were fireworks in Damascus celebrating the announcement. Was this expected?
I don't think necessarily that a lot of people saw the US lifting of sanctions on Syria coming, partly because there are attitudes within the Trump administration that are quite hawkish on Syria's current administration and on HTS. And there were no necessarily very clear indications that could allow us to anticipate such a development in the US's policy in Syria. I think it's fair to say that this seems to have been a direct outcome of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's personal interceding, I think, on this issue and using his personal influence and relationship with President Donald Trump. I think it's also important to note that the Syrians and President Ahmad Al Shara himself have been fervently lobbying for a lifting of US sanctions. So Saudi Arabia was the first foreign destination for the Syrian president. His first phone call was with the UAE president, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, and the first foreign leader that the Syrians received was the Qatari emir. And so I think the Syrians have also been on an energetic lobbying campaign in the region, and it seems to have paid off with President Trump's decision to suspend US sanctions on Syria.
Hasn't Trump, in his speech during the Gulf US summit, said that Biden had turned his back on the Gulf allies? And notably, Trump said that the Gulf is where his loyalties lie. And he also said that that's something that would never change. It's certainly a strong statement. What do you make of it?
It was a strong statement, not entirely accurate in the sense that relations with the Biden administration weren't all as, I think, difficult as President Trump sometimes likes to portray them. I think in the first and the initial phase of the Biden term, relations were difficult, and he very much had Saudi Arabia in the crosshairs. I think that there was nevertheless an attempt by the Biden administration to cement some of the defense and security partnerships. But I do think that on the bilateral level, President Trump is more likely to be forward-leaning with the Gulf states. I think he is less interested than the Biden administration in making security commitments. I don't think he's going to commit to defending Saudi Arabia or any of the other Gulf states. But I think he does have fewer qualms about selling the Saudis and the Gulf states more advanced US weapons. And he's already approved several arms sales to Saudi Arabia over the past few months, including laser-guided munitions and advanced air-to-air missiles. But I think it's also important to not to lose sight of some of the second order indirect consequences of what President Trump is doing on the global level, and how the trade war that he has been waging against China and the erosion of norms around sovereignty, when you have a US president talk about annexing Canada and Greenland, and all of the second order and indirect consequences that this can have on global economic growth, on oil prices, the idea of a potential US default on US debt, and given that the Gulf states hold over $200 billion in US Treasury securities and so on. So I think we have to keep in mind that, yes, the bilateral relations might be very warm, but there are indirect consequences of some of President Trump's broader economic and geopolitical policies that could have, I think, fairly serious consequences for the Gulf states as well.
One of the big questions now on the table is, will Saudi Arabia normalize relations with Israel? As we know, the US had been keen on this, but we've been seeing almost a rift form between the US and Israel, especially in recent weeks, with Trump saying that he's going to hold direct talks with Iran, while Netanyahu was sitting right next to him. And later, when Trump said that his attacks on the Houthis have ended, with Netanyahu later saying that Israel is going to defend itself by itself. Is the US getting closer to the Gulf and farther away from Israel, or is this just a temporary hiccup in the relationship?
It's clear that we're seeing quite a bit of daylight between Trump and Netanyahu at the moment. I think Trump's desire really and to engage in direct talks with Iran hasn't particularly, I think, pleased the Israelis. 2 months ago, President Trump had promised to annihilate the Houthis. And then a few weeks ago, he decided to sign a bilateral ceasefire with the Houthis that didn't seem to have any guarantees on the Houthis not attacking or refraining from attacking Israel or shipping in the Red Sea. And I think that the Israelis have also been upset about the way that the US has been trying to negotiate with Hamas over their heads for the release of the US hostage, and then potentially forcing Israel's hand into participating in the latest round of negotiations in Doha. Now, US policy under President Trump is very volatile. And I think we've seen wide swings over the past few months. And so I'm not sure that this is going to be the definitive state of US-Israeli relations. But I think insofar as the question of Saudi-Israeli normalization is concerned, my impression is that the Saudis and the Americans have chosen to take the path of least resistance, in the sense that they've decided to set aside the difficult issues on which they do not necessarily agree, and to compartmentalize those and instead move ahead very quickly on issues of mutual alignment and mutual interest. And I think you've seen that on the part of President Trump, who's been willing to decenter the conversation around arms and defense and civil nuclear technology from the question of normalization. And again, from the Saudi side as well, willing to put aside differences on the future and fate of Gaza, for example, or other issues where they may not necessarily agree with the Americans.
At the Gulf US summit, all the Gulf states almost mentioned Palestine, the need to establish a Palestinian independent state, and the need to end the bombardment of Gaza. And they weren't talking into a void. When President Trump is present at the table, they were clearly addressing him. And Netanyahu was sidelined during Trump's visit to the Gulf. Are we likely to see Trump pursue a different path towards the peace process in Palestine that does not require Netanyahu's approval? Can we see him usher the recognition of a Palestinian state, for example, without Netanyahu present at the table?
We really shouldn't underestimate the extent to which Israel has become a security concern for the Gulf states, and the extent to which the Gulf states perceive Israel's role, be it in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon, or in Syria, as being deeply destabilizing. And I think there is a lot of concern about a potential unilateral Israeli strike on Iran that could obviously bring war to the Gulf states' doorstep. So I think there is a real sense of concern around the nature of Israel's role in the region. The question as to whether they would be able to bring about a fundamental shift in President Trump's policy on Gaza, I think, is still very much on the table. It's not entirely clear that this will be the case. President Trump, I think, has remained, since his floating of the idea of a massive depopulation of Gaza and turning Gaza into a luxury seaside resort, we haven't really seen indications of a potential shift in US policy. But I think we should also not underestimate President Trump's capacity to surprise us and to keep us guessing. But I do nevertheless doubt that in order to be able to move forward with a Palestinian state, with a sustainable ceasefire in Gaza, you will nevertheless, I think, need to have the Israelis on board. And whether President Trump is able to deliver the Israelis through the powers of persuasion, coercion, or pressure, I think remains to be seen. And I think the US is probably the only country that is able to do so.
On Iran, we've also seen a lot of positive movement in recent weeks. As we know, the US and Iran have been negotiating indirectly about establishing a nuclear deal. There was some expectation that Trump would have announced something regarding the deal during his Gulf visit, but so far there are no indications. What do you think it would take for this deal to materialize?
I think what we know about these negotiations so far, which isn't much, by the way, is that they are focused on the nuclear conversation. And I think we also know that countries in the region, the Gulf states, I think this time around are supportive of that effort. By contrast to 2015, where they were somewhat more opposed. Now, what will it take? I think we don't exactly know what the terms of the negotiations are, but I think what we could reasonably expect is a high-level political agreement on setting certain limits to Iran's nuclear program, potentially in exchange for some economic relief. It could be simply walking back from the threat to impose more pressure on Iran, and this is a favored Trump bargaining tactic of threatening more pressure and then walking back from it. But I think Trump has been trying to build leverage over Iran by going after the Houthis, possibly by trying to persuade the Saudis and OPEC Plus to increase and ramp up oil production to bring oil prices down and essentially to squeeze Iran's revenue that way. Trump, I think, is hoping to reach a high-level political agreement where he can essentially put a lid, at least for the time being, on Iran's nuclear program without necessarily working out a very long-term or permanent deal with the Iranians.
That's it for Beyond the Headlines. On this very busy week, The National has covered the summit extensively on thenationalnews.com and on our platforms on social media. Visit our website for all the updates and more in-depth analysis. This episode was produced by Ban Barqawi and audio engineered by Arthur Edison. Yasmin Al-Taji is our assistant producer and Dua Farid is our editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.